Okay, this is the second lecture of Philo of Alexandria, Philosopher, Mystic, and Defender of His People, by Rabbi Lawrence Troster, August 27th. And today what I'd like to do is to finish up with the discussion of the nature of the Alexandrian Jews and what we know about Philo and his family. So if you'll turn to page 8 of the material I gave you last week, you'll see there something called Nicanor of Alexandria. If you go to Jerusalem, there's a very famous tomb in which a couple of famous Israeli politicians are buried. Here's a picture of the outside in Jerusalem. And it's known as Nicanor's Cave. That's because when it was discovered during the British Mandate, it was the tomb of the family of a man named Nicanor who had emigrated from Alexandria and come to Jerusalem. And what's interesting about it is, and there's the cave, this is the ossuary, the box that was found in the cave, which it's now in the British Museum. And on it, on page 8, you will see the inscription that's on the box. And the inscription has two sections, mostly in Greek, but also in Hebrew. It says, "The bones of the family of Nicanor of Alexandria who made the gates." And then in Hebrew, it says, Nicanor Alexa. And here's the inscription in its original, what it looks like on the ossuary. So who was Nicanor? Well, evidently, he was an Alexandrian Jew who emigrated to Jerusalem and helped make the gates of the temple when Herod rebuilt the temple. And this shows you that there was a lot of close contact between the community of Alexandria and Judea. And we know this, of course, from the time that the Ptolemies ruled over Judea, but also from things that we have found in Israel, such as a very famous ancient inscription from a synagogue that existed in Jerusalem for Greek-speaking Jews. And one of the fascinating things about Nicanor is there are a couple of legends of him in rabbinic literature. So if you take a look at the Mishnah tractate Midot has a discussion of the measurements of the temple, and it mentions the fact that there were 7 gates, and it refers to one is the Nicanor gate. And in the tractate of Yoma on Yom Kippur, it has a legend about Nicanor, that he came from Alexandria to bring the doors, and there are all these miracles that happened in order that to things that tried to prevent him from coming, how he overcame them. And if you go to page 9, it says, subsequently, all the gates of the temple were changed for golden ones, but the Nicanor gates, which were said to be of bronze, were left because of the miracles wrought with them, that he supposedly built the gates there and brought them to Israel. So leaving the fact, of the truth of the legend or not, we have here affirmation in rabbinic literature, which of course written down, several hundred years later, of the fact that this guy from Alexandria, this Jewish guy, who apparently helped to build some of the gates of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple by Herod. So this shows you the close connection culturally between Judea and Alexandria throughout the entire period. And as you'll see, we have even one reference to Philo himself going on pilgrimage, and also his family being involved with the temple. So we have to sort of see that even though this is a Greek-speaking community, there are deep, deep connections with Judea. And there were significant numbers of Judeans who spoke Greek. And even though Aramaic was probably more widespread as the common language, there were Greek-speaking Jews who lived in Jerusalem. In fact, we know from the New Testament there were numerous synagogues of Jews from particular areas of the Roman Empire. Like it used to be in the in the Lower East Side, you'd have a synagogue of Jews from this town and a synagogue of Jews from this town. That's exactly what was in Jerusalem, where people could go and speak with their countrymen. And most of the places that are mentioned in this New Testament text, I think it's in the book of Acts, are Greek-speaking areas. So there were a considerable number of Greek-speaking Jews in Jerusalem during the time of the temple. If you take a look on page 9, I want to show you briefly that this Hellenistic Jewish culture that I'm talking about, of which Alexandria was the center, was the origin of a large variety of literature, of which we only have, probably a fraction of what must have originally existed. And I've given you a few examples, these are by no means the only ones, of the kinds of literature, the widespread kinds of literature that one finds in this Hellenistic Jewish literature, which did not survive in the Jewish tradition, but it was preserved in Christian circles, sometimes only in quotations. Others we have found in fragmentary manuscripts and various other things. So first of all, you have Bible translations and commentary, which the Septuagint, of course, is the greatest example, but also a guy named Demetrius, who was an Alexandrian Jew in the 3rd century, who evidently is the earliest known Bible commentator that we have from the community. We have fragments of his Bible commentary. They wrote novellas and romances, including what is called Third Maccabees. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Maccabees, but which we know comes from the end of the 1st century. Some of the dating on this stuff is difficult, by the way, and sometimes there are works which probably started as Jewish but then had a Christian overlay. I'm only giving you the works that we know were actually written in Greek. There were other works, of course, that were written in Hebrew or Aramaic, but then translated into Greek. And I haven't included those, such as First Maccabees, for example. There were books of wisdom literature, such as the Wisdom of Solomon, which is in the Apocrypha, another work called Pseudo-Phoclides. You have poetry and drama. I mentioned him last time, Ezekiel the tragedian, who dates from the 2nd century BCE, lived in Alexandria, and we have fragments of, or quotations from a play that he wrote in the Greek style on the Exodus. He's quoted in Eusebius, a church father from several hundred years later. And we know of another poet named Philo. We also have history books, such as the letter of Aristeas and a few others, and including the great work of 2nd Maccabees. This whole 2nd book of Maccabees was written in Greek originally. We actually only have a paraphrase. The original apparently was much longer, written by a Jew in Cyrene, which is Tunisia today. And of course we have oracles and testament. There's a group of oracles called the Sibylline oracles, dating probably from around the 2nd century BCE. The problem is it's a very complex work. Some of it was written later, some of it may be of Christian origin, but this is just a taste of the huge amount of literature that this community produced, in addition to Philo. All right? And I haven't included Josephus in this, by the way, because, of course, he came from Judea, but all his works are in Greek. It's likely that he originally wrote them in Aramaic and had somebody translate them, but nonetheless, I didn't even include Josephus in this, and he in some ways is a critical figure of what you might call Jewish Greek literature, because his work only survives in Greek. Anybody have any questions at this point about this? Yes, Steve.
Were people like Philo and the other authors, could they read Hebrew easily?
Probably not.
So they refer to the Septuagint.
Yes, the Septuagint is their holy book. And Philo did not read Hebrew. Maybe a word here or two. He talks sometimes about the root meaning of a Hebrew word, or like taking the name Joseph and saying that it comes from the Hebrew word meaning to addition, So he knew a little bit of Hebrew, but he was probably not fluent.
It all on the Greek
Yeah, exactly. His Bible was the Septuagint, and this was what was this community's chief characteristic. Okay, so what do we know about the Alexandrian Jewish community? Let me just move this forward. We know that, again, this is one of the areas of scholarly disagreement. A polytuma was a recognized, formally constituted corporation of aliens, meaning non-citizens, enjoying the right of domicile in a foreign city, a city within a city. It had its own constitution and administered its internal affairs as an ethnic unit through officials distinct from and independent of those of the host city. This was not unusual in many cities around the Hellenistic empires and the Roman empires, that you had a group of foreigners who were not native to the area, who nonetheless may have lived there for a very long time, hundreds of years, who constituted a separate ethnic community and were recognized as a political entity, and this is called a polytuma. Not, by the way, unlike some of the Jewish communities in Europe during the Middle Ages. But polytuma, I think, actually had more rights than medieval Jewish communities. But nonetheless, there is a discussion among scholars whether or not the Alexandrian Jewish community was officially a polytuma or not. Many scholars believe that they were, just from the evidence that we have. The head of those communities was often referred to the ethnarch, meaning coming from the two words ethnos and arch, meaning head of, the head of the community of this ethnic enclave. We know that in Alexandria they had a council of 71 elders, which was called the Gerousia, and we will see them referred to in Philo. They were the kind of governing body of the Jewish community of Alexandria. They're often referred to in translation as senators, possibly because Gerousia in Greek has a similar meaning to the Latin senator. And there was a position known as the alabarch, the magistrate responsible for the customs in Alexandria. This was not specifically a Jewish position, but a position of great authority and therefore also of great wealth in Alexandria itself. And you will see that Philo's brother was the alabarch for Alexandria, which is probably a position that he got because of his friendship with the Julians in Rome. So, if you turn over to page 10, you will see there what we can construct of Philo's family tree. We don't know who his parents were. The assumption is that given how wealthy and powerful his community, his family was, they were probably not the first. In other words, it's very likely that this wealth was handed down in the family. One scholar likens them to the Rothschilds, that they were already wealthy by the time he was born. And the fact that many members of the family had the name Julius in their name suggested that their original patron may have been Julius Caesar. So his parents, we don't know who they were, but they were probably long-standing members of the Alexandrian community. There's no indication that they weren't, that they came from anywhere else. And so you have, Philo has two brothers. We think that Philo had the name Julius as well. We're not sure. His brother Alexander, who was younger than him, was probably born somewhere, 10 years after he was. He became the head of the family firm, so to speak. In other words, he was the alabarch. And he had tremendous influence and tremendous wealth and tremendous power, not just within the Alexandrian community, but also in the Roman Empire itself for a Jew of his time. We think they had a younger brother named Lysimachus, but we don't know anything about him. Alexander, we know, had two sons. We don't know about any other children. His son Marcus, who was known as Marcus Julius Alexander, took over the family firm after Alexander's death, and he married Bernice, who was the daughter of King Herod Agrippa I, which shows you how prominent the family was, that they married into the Judean royal family. Yeah.
What was the firm? What was their business, do you know?
It was probably handling a lot of, well, they managed the estates, some estates. They loaned money. They handled the customs for all of Alexandria, which was a huge trading city. So they were involved in what we would call trade and finance. Okay, they probably owned agricultural estates too. That was not unusual. That sort of thing. Now, here is the interesting thing, and we'll learn more about him. The younger son of Alexander, we assume he was a younger son, was named Tiberius Julius Alexander. And as you will see, he became a member of the Roman, a high official in the Roman government, as specifically the Roman army. And as such, was considered to someone who had abandoned his community, who had left being Jewish. All right, we'll see more about him because we actually know a fair bit about him from Josephus. So this is the family as far as we know. We don't know. Philo never mentions being married. We assume that he wasn't. Again, Philo does not actually himself give us very much biographical detail in the works that we have of his that survive of his. We know very little about him per se. So, but in Josephus, this family is mentioned numerous times. And I'm kind of giving them to you in the order in which they show up in Josephus. Now, Josephus wrote two main works as well as some minor works. One is the Antiquities of the Jews, which is a history of the Jews from the time of the Bible down to his own day. That was his second work. He probably wrote it around the year, towards the end of his life, somewhere around the year 100 CE. And he wrote, his earlier work was on the war between the Jews and the Romans, it's referred to as the Jewish Wars, or the Jewish War, and was probably written about 90, written sometime after the destruction of the temple when he was living in Rome, because that's what happened. He ended up living in Rome. Vespasian and Titus were his patrons. So I want to start with the Antiquities because it goes back to some earlier times that the wars doesn't mention. Sometimes there are differences between his account in something in the wars and something in the Antiquities, and it may have been because of when he wrote them. When he wrote the wars, he was writing it as as someone who Vespasian and Titus were the patrons, so he had to make the Romans look good, and he had to be a little careful. I think a little later he could be a little freer in what he had to say about what was going on. So, Steve, do you want to begin with the first passage from the Jewish Antiquities, book 18? He, Agrippa the First. Remember, that's King Herod Agrippa the First, the grandson of King Herod, who became the king of Judea for a few years before he died. Go on.
Okay. He, Agrippa first, then pretended that he would do as he, Herennius Capito, the procurator of Jamhes,
Which is Yavna, by the way.
bid him. But when night came on, he cut his cables and went off and sailed to Alexandria, where he desired Alexander the Alabarch to lend him 200,000 drachma. But he said he would not lend it to him, but would not refuse it to Cyprus. And as greatly astonished at her affection to her husband and at the other instances of her virtue, so she undertook to repay it. Accordingly, Alexander paid them 5 talents at Alexandria and promised to pay them the rest of that sum at Dicertia Puteoli.
That's in Italy.
And this he did out of the fear he was in that Agrippa would soon spend it. So this Cyprus set her husband free and dismissed him to go on with his navigation to Italy, while she and her children departed for Judea. Now,
this is a very interesting little episode, and if you look at the material I gave you today, you see some of the first page covers what I call the dramatis personae, you see there who Capito was, and also who Herod Agrippa was. Capito was an officer and procurator for the Empress Livia, the wife of Augustus, and for the emperors Tiberius and Caligula, and he was the procurator of Yamnia, which is the city of Yavna today. And during Gaius's Caligula's reign, he was not very friendly to the Jews. So evidently, Agrippa I had this debt, and Capitos tried to stop him from leaving the area of Yavna, possibly to throw him in jail for the debt. But Agrippa managed to escape him. He goes to Alexandria, and Alexander the Alabarch lends him this huge amount of money to pay off the debt. So this is the first mention of Alexander in Josephus, and you can see the connections between Herod Agrippa's family and the Philo's family, and also the immense wealth of Philo's family. You want to read the second one?
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
What is a procurator?
He's like a sub-governor. In other words, a governor is of a large province and a procurator is of the subgroups within that province. Smaller regions, yes. And shows you that if there's a procurator, it's a direct Roman rule, as opposed to a local vassal king. So now, in the second section is about the riot in Alexandria that we will be looking at from Philo's perspective. Go on.
There was now a tumult arisen at Alexandria between the Jewish inhabitants and the Greeks, and 3 ambassadors were chosen out of each party that were at variance, who came to Gaius Caligula. Now one of these ambassadors from the people of Alexandria was Appian, who uttered many blasphemies against the Jews, and among other things that he said, he charged them with neglecting the honors that belonged to Caesar, for that while all who were subject to the Roman Empire built altars and temples to Gaius, and in other regards universally received him as they received the gods, these Jews alone thought it a dishonorable thing for them to erect statues in honor of him, as well as to swear by his name. Many of these severe things were said by Appian, by which he hoped to provoke Gaius to anger at the Jews, as he was likely to be.
Okay, so after the riots in Alexandria, if you remember back to the timeline, which occur in 38, in 40 or so, there was a delegation, embassy sent from Alexandria to Gaius Caligula, both by the Jews and the Greeks, to talk about what had happened in the aftermath. And according to Josephus, one of the heads of the embassies of the Greeks is a guy named Appian. Philo doesn't mention Appian, by the way. He mentions somebody else. But Appian was a well-known Greek grammarian and sophist. And he hated the Jews. And we know about him because Josephus wrote a whole book against him. In other words, it was a polemic against Appian and others who, mostly Alexandrians, who were fulminating what we would call anti-Jewish attacks. Appian, interestingly enough, he settles in Rome, and he actually was the guy who was the author of the famous story Androcles and the Lion. Yeah. But none of his works survive. He opened a school in Rome, in which apparently Pliny went to, but he is an implacable enemy of the Jews, and according to Josephus, he's the head of the Alexandrian Greek embassy. And notice he says that there are 3 ambassadors from each group. Philo says there were 5. Now, since Philo was writing closer to the events themselves, Philo was probably more accurate on that regard. But then read on and see what he says.
But Philo, the principal of the Jewish embassies, a man eminent on all accounts, brother to Alexander the Alabarch, and one not unskillful in philosophy, was ready to betake himself to make his defense against those accusations. But Gaius prohibited him and bid him begone. He was also in such a rage that it openly appeared he was about to do them some very great mischief. So Philo, being thus affronted, went out and said to those Jews who were about him that they should be of good courage, since Gaius's words indeed showed anger at them, but in reality had already set God against himself.
So this is the only mention of Philo outside the works of Philo himself. That look at how Josephus describes him. He's the head of the embassy, a man eminent on all accounts, brother to Alexander the Alabarch, and one not unskillful in philosophy. So he was known in his own community as an eminent man of a prominent family, learned in philosophy, who by this point was fairly elderly by Roman standards, and he was in his late 50s, early 60s, and he undertook this voyage from Alexandria to Rome, where actually they were probably there for more than a year. These embassies, aren't things that are just immediate meetings. It took them a while to see the emperor. And he evidently, according to Josephus, didn't really get a chance to defend the community. And what was it that Apion accused the Jews of? When Gaius Caligula, at the end of his reign, declared that he was a god, he ordered that statues of himself be set up all over the empire. And Apion accused the Jews of not doing that and thereby showing themselves disloyal to the Romans. This goes to the heart of the conflicts between the Alexandrian Jews and the rest and the Greek Alexandrians, that they refused to participate in the civic rites that were considered not just religious rituals, but public acts of loyalty to the government. Yeah, Sam.
Gaius is another name for Caligula?
That's actually his real name.
Caligula.
No, Gaius.
Okay.
Gaius.
And
Caligula is a nickname.
And he was the head of the...
He was the emperor. If you take a look on the page I gave you today, his real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. And he was the nephew of the emperor Tiberius. And he became emperor in 37 after the death of the emperor Tiberius. And he was assassinated in 41. And his uncle Claudius became the emperor after him. But he's usually referred to as Caligula, but throughout the works you will see him referred to as Gaius, which is more properly his name. Yeah.
Is there a significant Christian community in Alexandria?
Not at this time, no. There was no Christianity really at this time. Remember, if you take a look at the dates, it was during the time of Tiberius that Jesus was executed. And so during the time of Caligula, it was a very small, the community was just really beginning to form. So there weren't no Christians in Alexandria at this point.
Do we know the basis for the riots in Alexandria by the Jews?
We will get to that.
Okay.
It's riots not by them, but between them and the other Greeks. And according to Philo, they're the ones you'll see how it got started. Okay, so if you take a look on page 11, what happens is that the embassy is there when Gaius Caligula is assassinated. Okay?
The embassy.
The embassy from Alexandria, the Jews, Philo and his group, are in Rome probably during the time when Gaius is assassinated and when Claudius is made emperor by the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was the personal guard of the emperor, an extremely powerful military group within the army and the society, and they often were critical in determining who was going to be emperor next. And this, by the way, was the first time that there was don't forget, Augustus was the first emperor. He then adopts Tiberius because Augustus has no sons, and his daughter Julia becomes disgraced and exiled. So Augustus adopts his wife's son, Tiberius, to become the second emperor. So it was a bloodless transition. And when Tiberius died, Caligula, his nephew, becomes emperor over his grandson Gemellus. And so this is the first time that an emperor is assassinated. And there's a violent change of power. This is the three generations of emperors at this point. Okay, so Claudius becomes emperor, and it seems that Claudius was a good friend of Herod Agrippa. So, Sam, do you want to pick it up on page 11, number C? This is from last week.
Now when Claudius had taken out of the way all those soldiers whom he suspected, which he did immediately, he published an edict, and therein confirmed that kingdom to Agrippa, which Caius had
It should be Gaius.
Which Gaius had given him, and therein commended the king highly. He also made all addition to it of all that country over which Herod, who was his grandfather, had reigned, that is, Judea and Samaria. And this he restored to him as due to his family. But for Abila of Lysanias and all that lay at Mount Libanus, he bestowed them upon him as out of his own territories. He also made a league with this Agrippa, confirmed by oaths in the middle of the forum in the city of Rome. He also took away from Antiochus that kingdom which he was possessed of, but gave him a certain part of Cilicia and Commagena. He also set Alexander Lysimachus the Alabarch at liberty, who had been his old friend and steward to his mother Antonio, but had been imprisoned by Gaius, whose son Marcus married Bernice, the daughter of Agrippa. These are sort of run-on sentences, aren't they?
Yeah.
But when Marcus Alexander's son was dead, who had married her when she was a virgin, Agrippa gave her in marriage to his brother Herod, and begged for him of Claudius the kingdom of Calicus.
Okay, so somebody want to close the door there. So here, this is what happens is that apparently we know a little bit about this, during the riots that occurred, Alexander had been thrown in jail by Gaius Caligula. Why, we don't know. We're not even quite sure exactly when that happened. But when Claudius becomes emperor, he sets Alexander, and here he's called Alexander Lysimachus, we don't know why. He sets Alexander free. The other interesting thing, of course, is that Claudia gave to Herod Agrippa a whole bunch of territories. You see, Herod the Great's kingdom was fairly extensive and included not only Judea proper, but a number of surrounding territories. When Herod died, his territory was divided up amongst his three sons, and eventually Judea proper came under the direct rule of the Romans. What Claudius does is he restores to Herod's grandson, Herod Agrippa, all of the territories that his grandfather had, plus a few others. So Herod Agrippa now has a fairly extensive territory in the area of Judea, Samaria, and various other adjoining territories during the time he is king, which is only a short time, unfortunately. And so he sets free Alexander. But notice also that here's where we get the information that Alexander's son Marcus had been married to Agrippa's daughter Bernice. But Marcus didn't live that long, and so when he died, Agrippa gives Bernice in marriage to his brother. In other words, a niece marries her uncle, which was not prohibited in Jewish law, by the way. Okay, so here's a little bit more about the family. That Alexander was a close friend of Claudius before Claudius was emperor. That he had been thrown in prison by Gaius Caligula for whatever, because of the riots, we're not sure. Claudius frees him, and Claudius grants Agrippa I, who obviously has a connection with Alexandria through his daughter, And so these are little bits of information we're learning about the family and their place in Roman society. And notice it says that the Alabarch had been the steward to Claudius's mother Antonia. That's a very powerful position, meaning he managed Antonia's estates for her, for which undoubtedly he was paid very well. Okay? All right. Ellie, do you want to read number D? Now we're going to learn a little bit about Philo's brother.
Then came Tiberius Alexander, a successor to
Fadus,
as procurator of Judea. He was the son of Alexander, the Alabarch of Alexandria, which Alexander was a principal person among all his contemporaries, both for his family and wealth. He was also more eminent for his piety than his son Alexander, for he did not continue in the religion of his country.
This is in 46. In 46, Tiberius Alexander was appointed the procurator of Judea. This was after the death of Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa only reigned for a few years, if you look at the time chart. And he was only king from 41 to 44. And when he died, his kingdom went back to being under direct rule by the Romans, a procurator. And the first one of those was a guy named Fadus. So Tiberius Alexander, born Jewish, is now so high up in the Roman government that he is appointed procurator of Judea in 46. And here we learn a couple of interesting things. We learn a little bit more about his father, principal person among his contemporaries, both for his family and his wealth, meaning he has yichus, as we say in Yiddish, and he was extremely wealthy. And it notice says that he was religious, whatever that means, and that Tiberius Alexander, his son, abandoned Judaism, which means he no longer identified himself as a Judean, as a member of the people of the Judeans. This itself is quite interesting, an issue. And we will see why, the only way that Tiberius Alexander could rise as well as he did was because he did this. As you will see why, for what he does. All right? So now we're going to talk about the year 66. This is just at the beginning of the wars with the Romans that sets off. Now, you have to understand that the war in 66, which led to the destruction of the temple, began as a series of riots that broke out between Hellenist Greeks and Jews. And it was not confined to Judea, but also occurred in Alexandria in 66. It was part of a widespread unrest. So this is the account of this, but at the beginning, Josephus tells us a little bit about the political status of the Jews in Alexandria. Ellie, you want to keep reading, but for Alexandria.
But for Alexandria, the sedition of the people of the place against the Jews was perpetual. And this from that very time when Alexander the Great, upon finding the readiness of the Jews in assisting him against the Egyptians, and as a reward for such their assistance, gave them equal privileges in the city with the Grecians themselves, which honorary reward continued among them under his successors, who also set apart for them a particular place, that they might live without being polluted by the Gentiles, and were thereby not so much intermixed with foreigners as before. They also gave them this further privilege, that they should be called Macedonians.
Okay, now, this is, of course, he's repeating a legend that isn't true. He makes it sound like it was Alexander the Great who founded the Jewish community of Alexandria and had gave them all these great rights. We know that that's not true. We know that it was Ptolemy II that emancipated the Jews later on. But notice he's giving the highest level of attitude, that they were equal with the Greeks. And the idea of being called Macedonians means not that they were Macedonians, but that they had the equal status of the Macedonians, i.e. the Greeks. We know that this is exactly not 100% true, but this is kind of what the Jews themselves might have been claiming at this point, that their rights go all back to the founding of the city itself, whereas we know from the letter of Aristeas that in fact that's not the case, that they didn't come into the city until Ptolemy I, and they came as slaves and then were emancipated by Ptolemy II. So this is putting the best possible picture on things. So then it talks about how the Romans got a hold of it, and then, and in effect, continued the rights of the Jews in Alexandria that they previously had, which, by the way, that itself was true. When the Romans took direct rule of Egypt after Cleopatra, they basically kept the status quo. So all the rights that the Jews had at that time, the Romans reaffirmed them. And by the way, within the Roman Empire, there was already a decree from the time of Julius Caesar that granted the Jews the special rights of practicing their religion without interference and exempting them from any religious public rituals that were offensive to their traditions. So the Jews had an established right of worship throughout the Roman Empire from the time of Julius Caesar. This was well known. All right? So then what happens? It talks about how there are conflicts. And take a look a little further down. There were these disorders, so there was a public assembly about sending an embassy to Nero, because after Claudius died, his nephew Nero became the emperor. He had adopted Nero as his adopted son. Interestingly, his own son, Germanicus, was too young at the time, so he made his nephew Nero, was he actually a nephew? Anyway, he made Nero, who was the child of one of his last wife, he made him emperor. And so it was during Nero that the wars broke out. And so because there were all these riots going on, they sent to Nero, they create this public assembly to send an embassy to Nero. A lot of Jews come to the theater where this assembly is going on, and this is where the riots break out. Okay? And if you turn over the next page, you will see that it turns into open warfare. Interestingly enough, at this time, Tiberius Julius Alexander, the son of Alexander and the nephew of Philo, and by this point we're assuming Philo was dead, he was now the Roman governor of Alexandria and Egypt. So he'd gone up in the world from procurator of Judea to governor of Egypt and commanding the Roman legions that were stationed in Egypt. So what happens? Take a look. What does he do? He in effect, first of all, he privately tells everybody to calm things down. In paragraph 8, things don't calm down. The riots continue. And look what happens. He takes 2 Roman legions. That's about close to 10,000 men, plus 5,000 other soldiers, meaning local auxiliaries. And he basically goes into the Roman, they go into the Jewish quarter, the Delta quarter, and they attack the Jews who try to defend themselves, and they, in effect, slaughter everybody they can find to the tune, according to Josephus, of 50,000 dead. Now, that may be an exaggerated figure, but evidently what happens is that here's a guy who was born in Alexandria from the most prominent Jewish family in Alexandria, sends the Roman legions into the Jewish neighborhood, and the Romans put down violence by extreme violence. They just slaughtered everybody as a way to stop things. So here is a sign of how this man had abandoned his own people, that he ordered the slaughter of his own community. Okay, the next paragraph, paragraph F, is from the Jewish Wars. And it talks about how during the wars with Rome, during, around 66, 67, Vespasian was one of the main generals of the Roman army, and he was the one who was sent to put down the revolt against Rome in Judea. So he arrives, I just want to get to the time chart again. He arrives in Alexandria, in the Galilee. Hang on, where did I put it here? He arrives in Alexandria, I think in 67. Yes, he arrives in 67 in the Galilee, and in 68, and Nero dies. And what you have in 69 is a year in which there were what's called the Year of the Four Emperors, where various Roman generals fight each other to become emperor. It's an internal civil war. And Vespasian ends up winning out and becomes emperor at the end of 68. And what he does is his son Titus takes over the fighting in Judea. He becomes the head of the Roman military expedition in Egypt, in Judea. Now, if you look on page 12, what happens is, Vespasian is trying to build his support to become emperor among what would happen is the various Roman generals and heads of the legions would line up with whoever they supported. So how did Vespasian become emperor? One of his chief supporters was Tiberius Alexander, who at the time, according to this, was the governor of Egypt in Alexandria, and therefore sent the Egyptian legions, the Roman legions that were headquartered in Egypt, to support Vespasian. And according to Josephus, this was critical in Vespasian's success of becoming emperor. So Tiberius Alexander has become a big-time player in Roman politics. Yeah.
Was the Roman Empire sort of a military junta like Egypt is now?
Yes and no. Let's just say that
other people forward.
Yeah, there were politicians, but in times of civil strife, whatever politicians or generals could control the most forces, usually they're the ones who prevailed. I mean, that's how Julius Caesar became head of Rome, right? And that was just a fact of life that had been around for a long time.
He conquered Gaul.
No, exactly not. Now, if you take a look on page 13, it talks about also about Tiberius Alexander's support for Vespasian, and talks about how he had been the governor of Alexandria. But then what happens is that Tiberius Alexander is then appointed the second in command in the army in Judea. That Titus, the son of Vespasian, is the commander, but his chief of staff, his second in command, becomes Tiberius Alexander. So here is a guy, again, born to the Jewish community of Alexandria, is now second in command to the Roman army that's attempting to squash the Jewish revolt in Judea. If you take a look at H, Josephus in the Jewish Wars has a long interlude where he describes in minute detail Judea, its walls, its fortifications, and a lengthy description of the temple that is pretty accurate from what we have discovered in archaeology. And notice what it says. The 9 gates of the temple that had silver and gold poured upon them by Alexander, the father of Tiberius. That Alexander the Alabarch had contributed enormous amounts to the to beautify the temple in Jerusalem. And this very temple, Tiberius was going to be involved in destroying. That's what's in number I. It talks about the fact that the night before the destruction of the temple, a fire had broken out on the Temple Mount. And the question was, it says here that Tiberius told the army to try and stop the fire. And according to this account of Josephus, there was a council at night. And notice who's there. This is the head of the military. Tiberius Alexander, the commander under the general of the whole army. And then it mentions the heads of the legions who were there. And there was an argument as to whether or not they should destroy the temple. And some of the generals said, yes, let's destroy the temple, and that this would stop Jews from ever rebelling again. According to this account, Titus argued not to destroy the temple, and that the temple ended up being destroyed was kind of an accident. We actually know from another account from a Roman historian that in fact, there's another version of this very same council from a Roman historian that says Titus said we have to destroy the temple. So we don't know who's true. But the fact is that Tiberius Alexander, as you see, was involved in the decision to destroy the temple or not. This is the second temple. This is the year 70 we're talking about. This is not the Babylonians. This is the Romans. Remember, this is the year, well, it's actually the year 69. The temple is destroyed in the year 69. No, sorry, it's 70. Sorry, I was wrong. It's in the year 70. The war still goes on for another 4 years because Masada holds out. So that's what we know about Philo's family, about himself and his family. We know he was a philosopher. He was eminent. His family was eminent. His family was extremely wealthy. They had tremendous connections with the emperor's families, with Gaius and with Claudius, and even going back to Augustus. We know that his brother was probably one of the wealthiest men in the Roman Empire. We know they had close connections with the Judean royal family, Herod Agrippa. We know that his nephew abandons his Jewish heritage and basically becomes, goes over to the Romans completely, to the point where he is on the general staff of Titus when the temple is destroyed. There is some indication, by the way, that Tiberius's career, we don't know when he died, but he may have had one step higher in his career. His final appointment, he may have been head of the Praetorian Guard under Vespasian and Titus, which would have made him one of the most important officials in the entire Roman Empire. And for a person who was born Jewish to reach that level of integration into the society is quite remarkable. Quite remarkable. Anybody have any questions about this? Okay, yes.
The first destruction of the temple?
The second temple in the year 70. Remember, the first destruction is 500 years before that by the Babylonians. Okay? Okay, so take a look now on page 14. Here, scholars have tried to divide up the works of Philo, because one of the questions that has to be asked is, who exactly was he writing all this stuff for? And what I've given you are more or less what's agreed upon by most scholars as to how to divide up his works and who he wrote for. We have some fragments of a work that are called Questions and Answers on Genesis and Questions and Answers on Exodus. And these are in fragments preserved only in Armenian translations, not in the original Greek. They were probably part of a larger commentary on the Torah. The nature of these works is that they were probably written for fellow Jews, because they're questions like, why did such and such do such and such? And they're relatively straightforward explanations. So we think that he had a category of his writing that he wrote for the average literate Jew in his community to explain things that come up in the Torah. Okay, so that's probably what they were. And again, we only have bits of it. It was probably much more extensive. The second category of his works are what's called the allegory of the law. These are exegetical, meaning biblical commentaries that are meant for non-Jews. It's evident from the way they're written that he is describing these books for a non-Jewish audience and trying to convince them of the worth of these books and of the superiority of Moses over Greek philosophers. So if you'll follow through, you will see he starts with a book on the creation of the world. He has one on Abraham. We know that he also wrote one on Isaac and Jacob, but they're lost. He wrote a work on Joseph. He has a work on the life of Moses, on the Decalogue, and a description of all of many of the mitzvot. That's what the special laws mean. And we also have some other fragments of other works. But these works generally, they paraphrase the biblical story. Like if you read the work on Joseph, most of it, or a lot of it, is just a description of the story of Joseph for people who've never read it. But in each one of these, he is also giving philosophical interpretations and attempting to defend these works as being important and explaining these things to people who don't know anything about them. So we're pretty sure that these are works meant for non-Jews. Then he has a series of works that are called the Exposition of the Law. These are highly philosophical and allegorical explanations of Genesis chapters 2 to 41, and we assume that they are for Jews educated in philosophy, like himself. They are highly philosophical and trying to understand the biblical text not only as what they literally say, but as deep, deep works of philosophy. And we're going to look at one of them in a little more closely eventually. But for example, the work on dreams is really about, it's the discussion of Joseph's dreams, but it's really more about, it's very philosophical. It doesn't spend a lot of time sort of talking about the obvious parts of the story. He already did that in his book on Joseph. And what's interesting is that his attitude towards Joseph in the book he was explaining to non-Jews versus the one on dreams is very different. In the work he wrote for non-Jews, he puts Joseph in a very positive light. In the work on dreams, he puts Joseph in a very negative light, interestingly enough.
Because of his self-centeredness?
Yes, and a whole variety of things.
What he eventually did to the Egyptians.
It's his self-centeredness, and he sees Joseph as a kind of allegorical figure of the worst vices that a person could have. Okay, it's quite fascinating, and you will see it's part of his political philosophy. He also had works that were very specifically philosophical and not Jewish in any direct way. And many of those have not survived or only preserved in Armenian. So he has a work called Every Good Man is Free, which was a sequel to a work that did not survive, meaning Every Evil Man is a Slave, right? A work on the eternity of the world, where he discusses the cosmologies of Plato and Aristotle and that sort of thing. On providence, meaning how much does God interfere in and direct the works of the world. Again, a lot of these are just survived in fragments. He has a whole discussion on whether or not animals have reason. So the last category, category E, are what are called his historical apologetic writings. These are treatises that are meant to defend the Judaism and the Jewish people to Jews and non-Jews. So he wrote a work called the Apothetica, or also referred to as the Apologia pro Judaios, which we only have two short extracts quoted by the later church father Eusebius. His work against Flaccus, which we'll begin looking at, and the Embassy to Gaius, where he talks about him going to Rome to defend the Jewish community against the emperor, and his work about a group of a monastic Jewish community called the Therapeutai, who lived outside of Alexandria. We only know about them from this one work, and he mentions them in one of the others. But this is a whole work describing this community of men and women who had become what we would call monks. It's evidence for a Jewish monastic community in Egypt. It's quite a fascinating book, well worth looking at. Anybody have any questions about this? Okay, we're now going to actually look at what we know from Philo's own writing about his life. So here you need to take up your book. So first of all, turn to page 594. And here, if you take a look, sorry, yeah, am I on 594? Yes, 594, the Special Laws, Book 3. And you look at the beginning. This is at the top of page 594 on the left side. Who would like to begin reading? Please.
There was once a time when, devoting my leisure to philosophy and to the contemplation of the world and the things in it, I reaped the fruit of excellent and desirable and blessed intellectual feelings, being always living among the divine oracles and doctrines, on which I fed incessantly and insatiably, to my great delight, never entertaining any low or groveling thoughts, nor ever wallowing in the pursuit of glory or wealth or the delights of the body, but I appeared to be raised on high and borne aloft by certain inspiration of the soul, and to dwell in the regions of the sun and moon, and to associate with the whole heaven and the whole universal world. At that time, therefore, looking down from above, from the air, and straining the eye of my mind as from a watchtower, I surveyed the unspeakable contemplation of all the things on the earth, and looked upon myself as happy as having forcibly escaped from all the evil fates that can attack human life. Nevertheless, the most grievous of all evils was lying in wait for me, namely envy, that hates everything that is good, and which, suddenly attacking me, did not cease from dragging me after it by force, till it had taken me and thrown me into the vast sea of the cares of public politics, in which I was and still am tossed about, without being able to keep myself swimming at the top.
Okay, this is
I
fascinating.
love that.
What is he saying?
He said philosophy, is really rarefied, but the practical notion of engaging in everyday life and politics is really miserable.
That yes, at one time he's studying philosophy, he's learning, and we will see perhaps having these mystical experiences. He's cut himself off from the day-to-day life. He's living in what we would call the ultimate ivory tower, right? Contemplating the heavens and God and having all of this wonderful thing.
It's like a forerunner to Kabbalah, isn't it?
Yeah, he is a kind of mystic. He is a mystic, and so what happens is that he's dragged back into everyday politics. So, in a certain way, he's telling us about the fact that when he got involved in the whole politics of his community, it was really not something he wanted to do, but that he felt he couldn't stop himself from doing it. This tells us a lot about his character, about what his ideal life would have been, a life of contemplation, right? Not of engagement in the world, the life of the mystic, the contemplative, but that, and we can understand this given his family and who he was. So he probably was a very reluctant participant in that embassy, right? And keep reading. But though I groan at my fate,
Though I groan at my fate, I still hold out and resist, retaining in my soul that desire of instruction, which has been implanted in it from my earliest youth. And this desire, taking pity and compassion on me, continually raises me up and alleviates my sorrow. And it is through this fondness for learning that I at times lift up my head, and with the eyes of my soul, which are indeed dim, for the mist of affairs, wholly inconsistent with their proper objects, has overshadowed their acute clear-sightedness. Still, as well as I may, I survey all the things around me, being eager to imbibe something of a life which shall be pure and unalloyed by evil.
he notices that this was his life in his younger days. That in his younger days he was able to be this life. And every once in a while, he's able to get a little bit more of that back. And that's what read on, because he talks about that a little more. And if at any time,
Unexpectedly, there shall arise a brief period of tranquility, and a short calm and respite from the troubles which arise from state affairs, I then arise aloft and float above the troubled waves, soaring as it were in the air, and being, I may almost say, blown forward by the breezes of knowledge, which often persuades me to flee away and pass all my days with her, escaping as it were from my pitiless masters, not men only, but also affairs which pour upon me from all quarters and at all times like a torrent.
this also suggests that long before the embassy, he was being forced into public affairs of his community. But there are times when he's able to escape. And he's able to go back to that state of contemplation. And I love the metaphor, sort of floating in the air like a cloud away from the politics. He sounds a lot like Maimonides in one of his letters where he talks about how difficult it is for him to escape, to go off and be by himself, right? That Maimonides rarely had an opportunity to be by himself and just, do the similar kinds of things. Read on, but even in these
circumstances, I ought to give thanks to God that though I am so overwhelmed by this flood, I'm not wholly sunk and swallowed up in the depths, but I open the eyes of my soul, which from an utter despair of any good hope had been believed to have been before now wholly darkened, and I am irradiated with the light of wisdom, since I am not given up for the whole of my life to darkness. Behold, therefore, I venture not only to study the sacred commandments of Moses, but also with an ardent love of knowledge, to investigate each separate one of them, and to endeavor to reveal and to explain to those who wish to understand them things concerning them which are not known to the multitude.
So it really shows the dual nature of his life. He cannot escape being a community leader. But on the other hand, he has this draw to be a contemplative. And so what he is doing in this book, in effect, he is saying, it's my responsibility to explain the beauty of the laws of Moses to everybody. This tells a lot about his mental state, doesn't it? That he is a searcher for wisdom and meaning and close connection with God. He is a deeply spiritual man. And yet, because he comes from a prominent family, and because he's looked upon as a community leader, he cannot abdicate his role in the politics of his day. So again, we have to make the assumption that when he was appointed to head the embassy to the emperor, that was not the first time he was involved in public affairs. Because that's really towards the end of his life. And he wrote this much earlier. But during his youth, he had this time to, and it's interesting, of course, that it's his younger brother who becomes so to speak, the head of the family firm. And maybe it just was the nature of him that, as he was growing up and his brother was growing up, he didn't have an aptitude for that kind of thing. But he ended up getting drawn into it no matter what, which he laments and yet accepts. But he finds time within himself and moments of tranquility to return to that wonderful place that he was in when he was younger. It's a lovely passage. It's a very revealing of him. Yeah. Take a look now at page 256. Here we have a little bit of what inspired him, his literary inspiration. This is from his work on the migration of Abraham, numbers 34 to 35, which are on the left side of the page, halfway down on page 256. Would somebody like to begin reading that?
Number 34?
Yes. Oh, Paul, you want to read it? I am not ashamed to relate. Number 34.
I am not ashamed to relate what has happened to me, to me myself, which I know from having experienced it 10,000 times. Sometimes when I have desire to come to my usual employment of writing on the doctrines of philosophy, though I have known accurately what it was proper to set down, I have found my mind completely barren and unproductive, and have been completely unsuccessful in my objects, being indigent at my mind for the uncertainty and vanity of its then extinct of living God, by whom the wound of the soul is at times open and at times closed up.
Stop there for a second. So he wants to go sit and write, and what does he have? Writer's block. He is devoid of inspiration. He admits the fact that the inspiration for writing philosophy, which he sees comes from God, sometimes is not there. It's just not there. Read on.
I have become,
and sometimes when I have come,
where?
35.
Oh,
The end of the line.
And sometimes when I have come to my work.
and sometimes when I have suddenly, when I have come to my work in an invisible manner, showered upon me an influence of divine inspiration. I have become influenced.
Greatly excited.
I have become greatly excited and have known neither the place in which I was nor the place which
Nor myself, nor what I was saying. Oh, in which I was, right.
I was nor those who were present, nor myself, nor which I was saying, nor which I was writing. For then I have been conscious of the richness of interpretation and enjoyment of light, a most penetrating sound, a most manifest energy in all that was to be done, having such an effect on my mind as the clearest calculator dimension would have on my VI.
So inspiration then can come to him and he forgets where he is, who he's talking to, what he's writing, and what is the image that fills him? Light. Light is one of the most important things as a symbol to him of the divine presence. And he feels filled with light. So all of a sudden, wherever he is, whoever he's talking to, or whatever he's writing, it all just fades out of his consciousness, and he is filled with this light of inspiration from God. It's a very, very interesting, it's very beautiful and very interesting. Turn to page 310. Here, he describes his education. Because it's one of the interesting things is, what did he study? What did he know? What was available to him in Alexandria at the time to have studied Greek philosophy? And Alexander was the center of what eventually became Neoplatonism, a kind of renewal in Platonic philosophy, but also a kind of Neo-Pythagoreanism as well was occurring in Alexandria. As well, there was a considerable influence from the Stoics. So there were all these currents that were going on in his city, and there were actual schools of philosophy where he must have gone and studied. So if you take a look on number 74, which is on the right side of page 310, part way down. Marianne, do you want to start reading at all events when I was first?
Here's 74. Okay.
Yeah.
At all events, when I was first excited by the stimulus of philosophy, to feel a desire for it, when I was very young, connected myself with one of her handmaidens, namely Grammar, and all the offspring of which I became the father by her, such as writing, reading, and the acquaintance with the works of the poets and historians, I attributed to the mistress, and at a subsequent time, forming connection with another of her handmaidens, Geometry, and admiring her beauty, for she had beautiful symmetry and proportion in all her parts, I still appropriated none of the offspring, but carried them to the citizen wife, and bestowed them on her. I was desirous also to form a similar connection with the third, and she was full of good rhythm, well arranged and well limbed, and was called music. And by her I became the parent of diatonic and chromatic and harmonic, and combined and separate melodies, and all the different concords belonging to fourths and fifths, and to the diapason. And again, I concealed none of all these things, in order that my legitimate citizen wife might become wealthy, being ministered unto by a multitude of 10,000 servants.
Okay. And so he's giving us his curriculum. Who is the wife? The wife is philosophy. She is the main thing, but in order to acquire her, he has to become aware of her handmaidens. And notice what they are. Grammar, right? Writing, reading, the poets, the historians, and then geometry, meaning mathematics, right? And music.
This was all in Greek.
So here you see what was considered to be by the basic curriculum of Greek education at the time. Grammar, writing, reading, reading the works of historians and poets, mathematics, primarily the geometry of the Pythagoreans, and music, because of course Pythagoreanism and music is interconnected. So by learning these basic, what are considered the basics of a proper education for an educated person in Hellenistic culture, he then could come to philosophy, because you can't have these if you don't study the preliminaries. Now, this is in addition to whatever Jewish education he got. And his Jewish education was, again, not Hebrew, but within Greek. He is extremely well acquainted with the Torah. He doesn't really talk very much about other books of the Bible, very rarely. He mentions very few of them. But the Torah, which was the centerpiece of the Alexandrian community, he knows extremely well. Okay, all right. Let's take a look on page 684. There's a really interesting little comparison he makes, which shows you some of his worldly entertainments. This is page 684, number 26, which is found on the right side of 684. Cal, do you want to read it? I have therefore now seen.
I am therefore before now seen among the competitors in the Pancration, at the public games, one man inflicting all kinds of blows, both with his hands and feet, all of them with great accuracy of aim, and omitting nothing which could conduce to victory, and yet, after a time fainting and desponding, and at last quitting the arena without the crown of victory. And the other who has received all his blows, being thoroughly hardened with great firmness of flesh, and being tough and unyielding, and filled with the true spirit of an athlete, and invigorated throughout his whole body, being like so much iron or stone, not at all yielding to the blows inflicted by the other. At last, by the endurance and resolution of his spirit, defeating the power of his adversary, so as to obtain a complete victory.
And he then compares us to the virtuous person. Now, what is pancratia? It is a form of sport that combines wrestling and boxing, and using the feet as well as the hands. And athletes would, fight in an arena, and the one who could, knock the other down was the victor. So evidently, he went to athletic events. He saw this thing, and he used this as a metaphor for the virtuous person who withstands the blows and, despite being maybe wounded or bruised, comes forward still as the virtuous person. So it shows you he went to sports events, which obviously Jews went to. Take a look at on page 695. Number 141, which is on the right side.
He had to be, this is really a prolific writer. This is all his work. And you call this a fragment?
Probably 2/3 of what he wrote. So, Cal, you want to pick it up on page 695, 141?
And it happened not long ago, when some actors were representing a tragedy and repeating those iambics of Euripides. For e'en the name of freedom is a jewel of mighty value, and the man who has it even in a small degree, as noble wealth. I myself saw all the spectators standing on tiptoe with excitement and delight, and with loud outcries and continual shouts, combining their praise of the sentiments, and with praise also of the poet, as having not only honored freedom by his actions, but having extolled its very name.
So, where was he? He was at the theater seeing a play of Euripides, by which we don't even have anymore. He quotes from a lost play of Euripides called it's a fragment. And in 142, he also talks about seeing another play of Aeschylus that we no longer have anymore. A lost play of Aeschylus about Jason and the Argonauts. So that in itself is quite interesting, but it shows you he was frequently at the theater watching Greek plays. And again, he uses these as, and this is one of his strictly philosophical works, not specifically Jewish. He uses these events as metaphors for philosophical, or more, in this case, moral ideas. Right? Okay, take a look on page 754. Again, one of his strictly philosophical works, and it's number 58, which is found on the right side of page 754. Cal, why don't you read that one too?
And if any man, being influenced by a spirit of laziness and indolence, living without arms and without preparation, dwell fearlessly among the haunts of wild beasts, then if anything happens to them, they must blame not nature but themselves, because when they might have guarded against any such disasters, they have neglected them.
So he's in effect saying, if you're living in a place where there are wild beasts and you haven't protected yourself against them, don't blame God for what happens. Yeah.
Man is responsible for
Yeah. Well, it depends. You put yourself in a stupid situation. You don't say, "Why is this happening to me?" You idiot.
Helps those who help themselves.
Well, yes, or praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. Go on accordingly.
Accordingly, before now, I have seen at the horse races some persons acting in a most careless manner, who, when they ought to have sat still and to have beheld the races in an orderly manner, standing in the middle, have been knocked down by the horses' feet and by the wheels, and have met with a proper reward for their folly.
So he went to the races, to the chariot races, and some idiots and the spectators have gotten too close to the races, and when they have, they've been knocked down and run over. So here's a guy who goes to see fighters, goes to the theater, goes to the chariot races. In other words, he's acting as well any citizen of Alexandria would do for entertainment.
He's in the society.
Yeah, and he's Jewish. So it shows you the likelihood is there were other Jews were doing this. Take a look on the next page. Number 64. Take a look. Steve, you want to pick it up? There's a city in Syria.
There's a city of Syria on the seashore, Ascalon by name, when I was there at the time when I was on my journey towards the temple of my native land for the purpose of offering up prayers and sacrifices therein.
We can stop there. He once went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And notice he calls Judea his native land. Judeans throughout the empire, and no matter how many hundreds of years they had lived, saw Judea as their native land, the way we refer to Israel as our homeland. And notice he went, like many, many, many Jews in the Second Temple period, he went on pilgrimage. This is one of the things that we know became quite common especially in the latter half of the Second Temple period, was that hundreds of thousands of Jews would come from all over the ancient world to Judea on pilgrimage, usually for one of the holidays like Pesach or Sukkot. Those were the ones that Jews came to Jerusalem for the most. So, like any good Jew, Philo went on pilgrimage. And you have to understand, for Jews at that time, it was like the Hajj for Muslims today. Yes?
Why was he going through Syria?
He wasn't going through Syria. Don't forget that whole area was called Syria.
Okay.
It was all part of the Roman province of Syria.
So Judea was part
Was
of
a
Syria.
subpart of what was called Syria. Okay? We're going to stop there. We've got a couple of more things that we learn about him, and then we will move on to the material that I gave you today, which will be on the two treatises about the riots in Alexandria and the embassy to Gaius Caligula. So we'll see you next week.